Right now, we're joined by ABC's Matthew Dowd, Georgetown University professor Michael Eric Dyson, and the dueling strategist James Carville and Mary Matalin. Thank you all for being here this morning. Matthew, let me begin with you. We just heard the senators there, and it was kind of interesting. It does seem like on both sides you have a real deep desire to avoid any kind of government shutdown anytime soon.
Well, when a disaster happens, in the aftermath of a disaster, which happened this summer when nobody won and everybody lost in the middle of it, from President Obama to Congress to everybody, they understand they can't go through this again, and they understand the country can't go through this again. My fear is that we're going to again have a temporary fix. It'll get through it, which would be better than not doing it, but we're not going to have any long-term fix for the problem that we associate with Washington, and you still have the general public out there that doesn't trust anybody in Washington, D.C.
Not trusting anybody right now, Mary Matalin, and you saw those senators who believe something will get done. Still some resistance among some Republicans, particularly in the House, to any kind of accommodation now to the Democrats on spending. Are you confident that deals in the Senate will get through the House?
The reason that the House is where they are, positioned where they are, is because half of them have been elected in the last two cycles, where spending has been a huge issue for Americans. Real Americans understand we cannot continue spending at the rates that we are. So I don't know. But Matthew's right in that this is no fix. This is just one step ahead of the sheriff, and that's why the trust factor is so low. And it doesn't comport with reality. The shutdown did not hurt the economy, if these numbers are to be
surprisingly,
believed.
yeah.
No, and it doesn't really hurt politicians in the larger sense. People just, it's like all the other packages and sequesters and all that. People just they just don't trust Washington. It all looks like a lot of nonsense to them.
A fair amount of good economic news out there this week, James.
Pretty good. I mean, it has gotten better. No doubt about it. The Democrats took a big hit after the health care rollout, but I think the combination of improving economic numbers and improving statistics on the healthcare thing might lead to a little better result, but we don't know that right now.
Meanwhile, Michael Eric Dyson, we saw this against the backdrop of these protests, pretty remarkable, probably the most extensive protests we've seen on the issue of economic inequality in quite some time. I guess one of the questions I have is, what do you think this is going to lead to in the end? You saw a lot of that resistance in the Congress.
Well, look, it's already changed the atmosphere in Washington, D.C. when President Barack Obama gives a major speech on income inequality. People on the left have been nipping at his heels for a while to say, hey, speak up about us. All politicians on the left and right have been speaking about the middle class, but they haven't talked about the working poor. And the working poor are the faces we see out there. The working poor go to work every day. They work 40, 50, 60 hours a week. They can barely make it above the poverty level. And when they do, they've got 2 or 3 jobs, and then they have a choice, kind of Sophie's choice in the urban area or even in rural areas where it's either my child in terms of education and I go to get the report card, or I stay at the work because if I miss to go to the school, then I'll lose one of my jobs. So I think it's a kind of triage going on there. And I think the bleeding out has led it even to the President of the United States of America to finally and substantively address the kind of social inequities that we won't be able to sustain. We can't even talk about job growth or what happens with terms of keeping up with inflation if we don't deal with the people who are at the bottom.
I think Michael touches on a really good point in this. It's the interesting dynamic we see now is we have a GDP, the product go up 3.6%. Everybody cheers. We have a job number that says we have wealth being accumulated by the top 5% in bigger numbers than ever before. We have more millionaires and billionaires than ever before, but 70% of the country believes we're off on the wrong track with all those positive numbers. And the poverty level today is higher than it's ever been. It's back to where it was before the Great Society came in. And I think that dynamic, whatever you define it as, economic inequality, economic mobility, whatever that is a building, brewing pot in this country, where the wealthiest people in this country are doing absolutely fabulous in certain pockets of this country, when the vast majority of the country are not, and they haven't been doing well for a generation.
Yeah.
Can I please, 7% unemployment, the new normal, if the labor force participation rate were really calculated in there, was what it was in the pre-recession, we'd be somewhere between 9 and 11% of unemployment. This is the worst recovery in almost 7 decades. The duration of unemployment is, the new normal is not a good economy.
But those aren't incompatible. I guess one of the questions I have is, how does the Republican Party get ahead of this, Mary? It seems like if you look at what happened in the last presidential campaign, Mitt Romney, maybe stylistically, it was very difficult for him to address this. But won't the party have to have a more populist feel to be successful the next time around?
Populist, it just has to be common sense, and it has to be full-throated. The biggest challenge of our time is not income inequality, it is job creation, which the president's signature issues have, domestic, starting with affordable health care, have reduced unemployment. Do you think people who are unemployed or are making low wages care more about that they don't have a job than how much you're making or any of us are making?
Well,
I don't think so. And that does not grow the economy.
Well, look, I think that's a false dichotomy in this sense. It's not that poor people are not, trying to, quibble over who's getting a bigger piece of the pie. The point is that they understand that those two things are related. They're not unrelated. So if you have income inequality that hard, where the stagnation of wages is the basis for the accumulation of wealth of those who've got a whole bunch, then look, the pie is shrinking for those at the bottom, and it's not a question of their envy of those at the top. It's about, can I get enough daycare to help me out?
How is it shrinking, Professor, with all due respect? Are you saying as people make wealth, then poor people get poorer? How does that work?
I'm saying to you that the distribution mechanisms in government that yet allow wealth to trickle upward and not downward create a chasm between the have-gots and the have-nots, which is what President Obama tried to
Can I just make one jaw-dropping point? This week it came out, a UC Berkeley study, Golden Study, said 1/3 of all bank tellers own public assistants. This is bank tellers. These are people that have a level of skill. It's actually something I did one time in my life. Why don't we pass a law to say if you were bailed out, or you get free money from the Fed, or your deposits are insured, or you too big to fail, if the government backs you to that extent and you're that profitable industry, you have to pay your people a living wage. Why do we have 1/3 of our bank tellers in this country? It's not that finance is not making a lot of money. That's not the question at all.
George, in the politics of this, and you asked the question, which are the Republicans doing this? And I think the Democrats and the Republicans are trapped in an old mantra and an old status quo. Republicans refuse, in many ways, to take on Wall Street in a direct way. They would be so much benefited if they'd adopted some of Elizabeth Warren's message, adopted some of her message to say the big corporations, the big banks, and Wall Street have taken us down this path, along with a Washington isn't fixing the problems. Democrats, on the other hand, many of them have an anti-Wall Street, anti-big bank, anti-big corporation, but they're stuck in a mantra that the government needs to solve this problem. If somebody came along and said, I'm going to bridge this, and it's about Washington isn't doing the job, Wall Street isn't doing the job, we need to go back to middle America.
And you know who is doing that is the Tea Party and Ted Cruz and the Republican establishment. We're just going to disagree on this.
Let her say how the Tea Party is doing it, then respond.
On the continuum of Cruz and Rand, I know you don't like his Detroit project, but it's better than another bailout. They are proposing exactly what you're saying.
No, they don't have a collective solution. What they say is let's return it all to the individuals. They don't have what we need is a collective solution to the problem that's not based in Washington.
Can I say something? Let me jump in this too. See, when you say it's not a government, it hasn't been caused by government. I disagree. Look, when you talk about unemployment, it may be going up to 7, 8, 9% if we adjust it. Look at what happens in Latino and African American communities, where the unemployment now in the raw numbers is like 15.5, which means closer to 20. So if the government project of keeping people out of business, when you talk about a disproportionate number of black and Latino people working in the public sector, when you have an attack on the public sector, firemen, teachers, and the like, police people, you're talking about people who have had an opportunity to have a job because of the practices of discrimination in the private sector. We can't depend upon the private sector itself to adjust for its own bias when it's prevented people from flourishing.
This is a debate with Democrats and Republicans. James, there's also a debate going on inside the Democratic Party right now. Elizabeth Warren and a lot of her fellow progressives fear that Hillary Clinton and others will be too close to the big banks.
Well, there was a third way thing back and forth, and that's always been a thing in the Democratic Party. We've had the kind of Wall Street Democrats and the more populist Democrats. I think that the party is sort of moving away, but I'm going to give credit to Wall Street because Wall Street gave the most succinct analysis of what's going on in this country, and it's given by none other than Lloyd Blankfein, who is the CEO of Goldman Sachs, who said, we know how to create wealth, we just don't know how to distribute it. And the truth of the matter is that as we have this conversation, is absolutely right. It's not a lack of wealth creation. It's a lack of people that are sharing in the benefits in this company. That's why the minimum wage, bank tellers, and all these things.
2% of the country has benefited in the last 20 years.
Keynesian claptrap. The one thing you can say about Elizabeth Warren is that she's a full-throated, proud, loud liberal, unlike the president who tries to dress up his rhetoric. She is saying what a liberal agenda would look like, which has never worked.
But it's also common sense, because Elizabeth Warren also asked when she was attacked in that Wall Street Journal op-ed, she just said, look, tell me, be transparent. Tell me who's bankrolling you. What banks are in bed with what think tanks that really circulate knowledge?
Elizabeth Warren is right that the Wall Street has accumulated most of the wealth in this country, while the rest of the country has not benefited from it. She is absolutely right.
Do we think that unregulated financial capitalism has worked brilliantly? I don't think there's a single person in the world that would say that.
Unregulated,
No, hold on a second, guys. We only have a couple minutes left, and before we go, I do want to get your reflections on Nelson Mandela. Michael Eric Dyson, I know you met him, and so many American political activists really cut their teeth fighting for Nelson Mandela.
No question. I'm of the same generation as President Obama, and taking a stand against apartheid, both in the university community and more broadly in terms of, dealing with disinvestment strategies, but also challenging Ronald Reagan's constructive engagement approach. I think conservatives get a little bit of amnesia here when they forget that Dick Cheney wanted to put him on the terrorist list and insisted he stay there, that Ronald Reagan resisted. He said on the one hand Nelson Mandela should be released, but he depended upon a white supremacist government to reform itself from within. I think Nelson Mandela challenged that. Also, though, he challenged people on the left as well.
Amnesia, Mary?
When will you ever get tired of beating up on Darth Vader, who said Nelson Mandela is a good man? As we've seen in your earlier segment, it was a complicated situation. The ANC was a terrorist organization at one point. He has since said wonderful things about Nelson Mandela. What I want to say about Nelson Mandela I like that what's been said about him was said in the same week that the Pope said what he did. It's forgiveness and redemption. The Pope's widely misinterpreted and mischaracterized statements, but it's active engagement. It's taking care of each other with solidarity and subsidiarity.
But look, when you say about excusing Darth Vader, so to speak, this is not just about rhetoric. This is about public policy that prevented the flourishing of ANC. And look, when they had their feet on the neck of Nelson Mandela and millions of black people in South Africa.
Look, the greatest thing about one of, I think Nelson Mandela was here. He said, let's forgive Dick Cheney, let's forgive these people, let's move on. That's what he would say. But I think one of the fascinating things about Nelson Mandela, he wasn't a saint. He made a lot of mistakes. He was readily admitted it. When he asked about that, he said, I'm not a saint unless you think a saint is a sinner who gets up and tries every time. Here's a guy that, for all of that frailties, was immensely one individual, helped change an entire country and a world in what he said. And it was done through acts of humility, like the Pope has done. Authentic acts of humility.
But it's not just about business, it's also about justice.
One of the great things about my life is I got to live at the same time he did. And I think he's almost, and if you look at like Christ, he was everything you said. He was forgiving, he was flawed, he was everything that a human being is and everything that a great human being is. So we should embrace all of it. But more than that, you spend 7 years in jail, am I right?
Yeah.
And you forgive your jailers. That's a pretty, that's reading the New Testament
forgiveness
somewhere.
has to be tethered to justice. It's forgiveness and justice at the same time.
That is going to have to be the last word. Thank you all very much.